up with all you guys.
I generally never feel old. I look at the person does that happen? I'm really just 25.
All right, everybody. Thank you all for being here. Before we get to our wonderful panel, we have a couple of announcements, and we want to kick off by letting one of our funders say a few words. So this is Lauren Thomas. She's from the Student Sustainability Council. And so I'm going to turn the mic over to her before we get going.
Thanks. Hi, so as she said, my name is Lauren Thomas. I'm a sophomore here at UK, and I'm also an at-large member of the Student Sustainability Council. We are a student-funded and led group here on campus. Each semester, each student pays $3.50 of a student fee and into what is combined to a fund that the SSD overlooks the allocation of towards sustainable projects here on campus. And we've been partnering with DOPE for 6 years now, I think it is, and we're very excited to put it on again for this year. We're very passionate about what they stand for in terms of their intersectional approach to sustainability, and we're very excited to be a part of it. So yeah, thank you so much.
So for anybody who hasn't encountered me today, I am Lauren Moore. I am your program co-chair along with Chaya Kolawali here. So we've been at the registration desk and been really excited to meet a lot of you last night and today. And I'm really thrilled to be here and be part of the 6th annual DOPE. Out of curiosity, how many people have been to all 6 years of DOPE? All right. 5? Okay, 4? Nice, 3? 2? How many of you are here for the first time? Wow. We are so glad to have you here, and we're so thrilled to have so many people from all across the U.S. and the globe. And I wanted to go ahead and, before we really get started, we have all the logos of our various funders here tonight, and we want to say thank you to all of them, to several different departments, geography, anthropology.
Sorry.
Yes, woohoo. Philosophy as well, yes, and the UK Appalachian Center. And a special thanks to UK's Food Connection, which is a new organization that has given us special money this year to fund our Ecology's Agriculture, Food, and Justice track, and also for local foods and the things that you've eaten. So in case we didn't have signage up, you had local eggs this morning, pastries made with local flour, and local cheese tonight. So we'll also be having some local beer and more local foods at the reception. Local beer. We're all very excited about it. So thank you to the Food Connection for doing this. I'm really thrilled about our panel tonight. I think it's going to be fantastic. This is a great group of scholars we have together. This continues to be one of the simultaneously most intellectually stimulating and friendly conferences I've ever been to. So that's thanks to all of you. So thank you for making this such a great conference. And finally, I'll be back up here at the end, but I want to remind all of you that we do have a catered reception following this event at the Boone Center. So we'll sort of all rise and walk en masse over to the Boone Center. So don't forget to follow the crowd because we want to feed you, and we'll actually have a live bluegrass band as well. So we'll have some live music for you. So I want to turn the floor over to Dr. Rich Stein from one of the departments that has been a long-standing supporter of DOPE, the geography department here at UK. And Dr. Stein himself has been a long-standing supporter of DOPE. So thank you. Thanks, geography.
You're really attack. You don't know what I'm going to say. They gave me a microphone, and your only hope is my iPad's about to run out of battery. So I have 3 things I would like to do in the next couple minutes. First, add to the welcomes. I guess I'm here in an administrative capacity. I will welcome you on the part of all the kind of formal things up here, the Department of Geography, the Sociology Department, Philosophy, Appalachian Studies. There's some anthropologists, but they're sitting in the back row. Watch and see if they speak out already. The other thing, so part of that first thing is some organizers said, would you speak a little bit about the history of dope? And I don't really want to do that. Although it's hard to believe this is actually the sixth one. They started out as a small, little, local kind of thing, and now there are over 400 people this year, and it's an international venue. And I think the reason I don't want to speak about the history of dope is because I don't need to, because the history of dope lives on in its organizational collective wonder, because that's what it is. It's all students all the time. And I don't know how to say this other than those people who I represent up here who are not students couldn't be more proud of these guys for what they've done over the last 6 years in getting this together. You know, it's kind of, I do want to do that, but first I want, like, they have this organizational structure. It's co-chairs, core organizers, I forget it. Anybody who's been helpful, got dope organized, stand up. Now it's okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing I want to do is I want to welcome you as an historical geographer, as a scholar who actually also participates in dope, and as a local resident. So I hope you get a sense of this place. I'm a geographer while you're here. There's much for political ecologists to appreciate in the landscape of central Kentucky. We're still an agricultural state in many ways, built in part on vice. Bourbon, horse racing, tobacco. The cultural landscape you might see here is a place where the super rich consume conspicuously, and it's consciously constructed socio-nature that serves as an accumulation point in international flows of capital. We offer you Rand Paul, Mitch McConnell, Kim Davis, and the solid front against environmental protection underwritten by Big Coal. We're also, right now, as I speak, undergoing an assault on higher education in the wake of Scott Walker and the Koch brothers, especially in this building, personified in Army government. But we also have Wendell Berry and Frank Walker and Appalachian poets and Nikki Finney and groups like the Alliance for Appalachia and the Mountain Association for Community Economic Development. We have a tradition of grassroots advocacy for labor and environmental issues, and this city is unexpectedly progressive as one of the first consolidated urban county governments in the U.S., with a sharply drawn urban service boundary and burgeoning social environmental activist scene that's changing the face of this city. Some of those folks in that activist scene are here today. They've always participated in dope, and I hope you get a chance to talk with them before you leave. My friend John Paul Jones used to say that Lexington itself has everything a big city has, but we only have one of them. Well, he left. And we have a lot more than that now. We have a lot more than that now, and I hope you get a chance to enjoy some of them in addition to the conference. And if you're on an academic's budget and you're looking for a best value for money bourbon, I recommend W.L. Weller Reserve, made from the same mash bill as the famous weeded bourbon, Pappy Van Winkle. It's locally produced. If you have richer tastes, see me later. Okay, now, number 3, this is what the organizers thought I was going to do. I'm going to introduce the panel very, very quickly. Okay, so you've got 4 people in front of you who are going to inform you over the next little while. The moderator today is Carolyn Finney. I'm especially pleased to introduce Carolyn, as she's our newest faculty member in the Department of Geography. She's the author of Black Faces, White Spaces, and her research coalesces around questions of difference, identity, and nature. Carolyn's especially committed to public methodologies that require participation, partnerships, collaboration, and radical epistemologies. The 3 panelists in front of you include Sapana Doshi. She's an assistant professor in the School of Geography and Development at the University of Arizona. She studies the cultural and environmental politics of urban post-colonial capitalism, especially in Mumbai, where she's looked at social mobilizations, displacement and dispossession, and slum redevelopment projects. Her work demonstrates the shaping power of class, gender, and ethno-nationalism in differential embodied experiences and claims-making practices, and her historical interests extend to 19th century colonial infrastructure, politics, and state formation in India. Nick Heynen is professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Georgia and director of Georgia's Integrative Conservation PhD program. He writes on urban political ecology and social movement theory with specific interest in environment and food politics. His research focuses more broadly on analyses of social power relations and their inscription and transformations of nature space and the interrelated connections between those processes and vulnerable populations. And last but not least, Nathan McClintock is an assistant professor in the Toulon School of Urban Studies and Planning at Portland State. His work explores food systems, cities, and the environment, and especially at the intersection of urban agricultural movements, food systems policy and planning, and specific urban political economies and historical geographies in which they arise. All of this is aimed at understanding how urban agricultural policy and practice articulate with power, political economy, race, class, and gender, even as he also is committed to community-engaged research, which he's done around the world as a researcher, journalist, Peace Corps volunteer, food policy council member, and farmer in a half dozen countries. So welcome to them, and I'll turn this over to Carolyn.
So, yeah, that's pretty much, I've dropped my mic, I'm gone. Do I need to use the mic? All right. So, I just want to give you some idea of what's going to happen. I mean, I don't really know what's going to happen, but how we'd like it to go. I'm going to try not to talk a lot. Each panelist is going to take about 15 minutes to talk. Then I may take a moment just to break it down in my way, but then we really want to open it up to you. We want to put some questions to the panelists. The panelists may have some questions for you. Let's make this a really sort of engaged conversation. I have my phone out, not because I'm looking to see if I have any emails. Does anybody love me? What I'm doing is just watching the time, because it's not something I'm really good at. I shouldn't say that out loud. He knows that, yeah, okay, we're not even gonna go there. So the only thing that I want to do, so it's going to go in this order, right? You said, it's Sapana, and then, yeah, I got it all wrong, and then the only thing that I want to start it off with is just the title of the abstract for this session. The first half was a Tupac Shakur poem, so I'm just going to read it because it's very short, but actually it was something that each of the panelists kind of used partly to think about what it is they want to share with you today. The Rose That Grew from Concrete by Tupac. Who needs a last name? He doesn't. Did you hear about the rose that grew from a crack in the concrete? Proving nature's laws wrong, it learned to walk without having feet. Funny it seems, but by keeping its dreams, it learned to breathe fresh air. Long live the rose that grew from concrete when no one else ever cared.
Thank you. So the title of my talk is, oh, am I on?
Yeah, you have to use that one too.
I do have to use that. Oh, okay, great. Okay, so the title of my talk is Embodied Urban Political Ecology, 6 Propositions from the Post-Colonial City. And so when I say from the post-colonial city, I don't mean that it refers only to the post-colonial city. It's in the effort to sort of create theory from the South. We know the direction in which theory often flows, and so it's a provocation in that regard. So, on the morning of March 4th, 2015, Kalpana Pimpale died by falling through the collapsed floor of a multi-story public toilet near her home in a slum located in Mumbai's poorest, most underserviced ward. In a city, and this is a photo of the toilet. In a city where half the population lacks in-home sanitation and a single toilet seat must be shared by up to 1,800 women, such everyday metabolic functions are shot through with historically sedimented relations of inequality and precarity. The tragedy of this preventable death, briefly though unequivocally, exposed the violence, betrayal, and hypocrisy of ostensibly inclusive development programs in Indian cities. The Swachh Bharat campaign, or Clean India campaign, of the present Hindu nationalist and neoliberal developmentalist government promises inclusive progress and ecological deliverance by ending open defecation and constructing toilets for all. Indeed, prior to her death, her tragic death, Kalpana Pimple might have been considered one of the lucky beneficiaries of clean city infrastructure projects. In this case, the toilet clock was constructed by an NGO that has been celebrated around the world for its participatory best practices. The group has recently been lambasted for a variety of mishaps in their projects. And yet, this assignment of culpability belies processes that perpetuate structures of underinvestment, displacement, dispossession, and neglect. That the provision of public goods can result in as much death-dealing risk as living without attests to the contradictory ecologies of post-colonial development. What would it mean to learn urban political ecology through the embodied experience of Kalpana Pimple and the thousands of other women and men upon whose bodies struggles over urban space and resources are waged on a daily basis? The story of Kalpana Pimple's death is one that shows how the persistent privileging of elite and transnational accumulation continues to expose so many to harm, despite gestures to inclusive development and environmental improvement. And yet it also demonstrates the lived nature of geographies of dispossession and the conditions of possibility for life in politics. Following Heynen's claim that embodiment represents the frontier of the field, I argue that an embodied perspective can reveal much about the complex layers of urban power and socio-nature, as well as the horizons and limits of environmental struggles in the city. Everyday exposure to risk and hardship occurs in diverse forms and degrees to shape intimate material experiences and subjectivities in cities. I propose an embodied urban political ecology grounded in a feminist, anti-racist, and post-colonial approach, consisting of 6 orienting, though not exhaustive, propositions. This approach also follows calls to provincialize urban political ecology, to attend to the racialization of environmental injustice, as well as post-colonial intersectional analysis and other affective feminist political ecologies. I begin with the foundational proposition. Metabolism is embodied politics, not just metaphor. Since its inception, urban political ecology has deployed the metaphor of metabolism to describe how city natures are organized in relation to dominant socioeconomic functionings in cities. Scholars have since critiqued functionalist readings of urban metabolism in favor of more hybridized and relational approaches. Embodied urban political ecology contributes to this reorientation by highlighting differentiated environmental experiences and subjectivities, as well as the contingency and contestation in cities. One such example is the deployment of the Plenari's famous notion of the politics of shit, which elucidates the contours of citizenship for post-colonial urban residents who, by virtue of their poverty, propertylessness, and other social locations, and I'm talking about caste in particular, cannot be distanced from their own waste. I hesitated in drawing on this example of Pimple's tragic death because of the trivializing ways that certain bodies and spaces become too easily associated with waste in our social imaginaries. Nonetheless, as feminists have long argued, silence and taboo obscures the diversity of bodily experiences and perpetuates violence. It is critical to note that the conditions that produce uneven exposure to damaging environments and bodily harm do not prevent the poor from attempting to create cleaner and safer environments. For instance, Desai et al. Show how women slum residents in Mumbai may actually turn to open defecation, a stigmatizing and dangerous activity in its own right, as a way to mitigate the bodily harm of badly constructed, under-maintained, filthy, ill-lit, and overburdened public toilets. Such actions are often misinterpreted and vilified by upper classes whose environmental judgments and actions deepen exclusion and inequality, which brings me to my second proposition. Urban development and even greening and sustainability efforts produces highly differentiated and often increased exposure to harm. The public toilet incident I presented appears an extreme case of vulnerability caused ironically by improvement projects. But I would argue that in fact, this is only one instantiation of, quote, state-sanctioned, group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death, Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism, which is now classic, I think. Uneven and elite-driven development, for instance, has meant that extreme global climate events, including heavy rains and floods, disproportionately affect the poorest and most marginalized neighborhoods, from New Orleans to Mumbai. Despite enduring greater vulnerability to processes that are not of their doing, these residents are often vilified as polluters through what Bhaviskar has called bourgeois environmentalism. For instance, studies show that recent flood disasters in Indian cities have been caused by rampant real estate-driven development on sensitive storm drains and wetlands. Yet residents of informal slums are routinely blamed and evicted in environmental improvement campaigns. That the capacity to reproduce healthy life is constantly threatened brings me to my second point. Proposition 3, social reproduction, what Marx defined as the labor it takes for workers to arrive at the factory every morning, matters for urban ecology. Expanding and reworking earlier Marxist feminist urgings to look beyond capital-centric production politics, feminist geographers have shown how the quote, messy, fleshy stuff of everyday life is a political sphere that is too often ignored in masculinist and disembodied economic analyses, but central to long histories of accumulation. In other words, paid and unpaid labor within the, quote, global household is as critical to the maintenance and production of wealth as factory work. The fact that the majority of the world's informalized poor, increasingly rendered into surplus populations by successive rounds of displacement and dispossession, do not have access to the minimal livelihoods in industrial jobs promised by development, has created the conditions of deepening global precarity. An excellent recent volume edited by Meehan and Strauss builds connections between embodied precarity and social reproduction, highlighting the ways that life's work is increasingly burdened by sharpening socio-spatial inequalities. Devalued and unpaid social reproductive labor, like nature itself, plays a central and invisible role in capital accumulation. Embodied ecologies reveal power-laden processes that differentially value and devalue the labor of those who are routinely exposed to harm in the effort to reproduce urban communities. Such laboring bodies are also marked by gender, class, and caste, or ethnicity, in ways that naturalize associations with waste and legitimate the devaluation of their work. This leads to my next point. Urban ecologies are shaped by multiple and intersecting relations of power and difference. Feminist political ecologists have begun to integrate the framework of intersectionality to push the boundaries of singular class and gender, and even gender analyses, to include race and other axes of difference. In the case of Mumbai and other Indian cities, such intersectionalities have concrete repercussions for communities among the poor who are multiply marginalized and discriminated due to ethnicity, religion, and caste. For instance, many neighborhoods occupied by Muslims and North Indians in Mumbai are targeted for eviction, being designated as illegal slum dwellers and excluded from public water, sanitation, even the really shoddy kind of sanitation, as well as resettlement programs. These exclusions arise from embedded structures of discrimination in slum redevelopment policy, sociospatial segregation, and violent ethno-nationalism. In a similar vein, Northern environmental racism scholarship, and I heard a lot of great talks today in this vein, shows how racialized violence is perpetuated through policing, environmental harm, and differential access to the means of health. Race and identity-based marginalization also increases vulnerability to sexual and other forms of gendered violence, conditions that are steeped in racial gender regimes that deny so many the very basic status of humanity. Still, we must be careful to not simply add up differences, to calculate oppression, or assume that all identities matter at all times. At key conjunctural moments of political and economic crisis, certain productions of difference may gain salience, while others may recede. So Proposition 5. Affect and emotion are also part of the materiality and embodied ecology of cities. And this is something that's still developing, I think, for me and probably others in the field. Traditional political ecology analysis focused on struggles over resources and environmental harm have generally paid less attention to affective dimensions of politics. And yet numerous studies show how trauma becomes hardwired into biochemical experiences and even passed down epigenetically. Political ecology is just beginning to address embodiment in this regard. Recent feminist studies highlight, for instance, how the experience of suffering linked to struggles over water and urban land are simultaneously biophysical and emotional. This is an important and rich arena for further research that can bring unique insights into the formation of new political subjectivities. So my final proposition. Bodies that are subject to urban environmental precarity and labor exploitation are also sites of the production of new political subjectivities with complex and sometimes contradictory agency. Differentiated embodied experiences result in a wide range of claims-making practices, including but not limited to collective demands for land, resources, dignity, health, and safety. However, embodiment forces us to contend with the complexities of emerging political subjectivities. For instance, in Mumbai, women slum residents have pursued slum clearances and market-based development in the aspiration of attaining better living conditions through resettlement, sometimes at the expense of their other needs, as well as more marginalized urban residents. Others have contested the illegalities of elite developments, shoddy and distant resettlement, displacement, and identity-based marginalization. Understanding embodied experiences helps to understand these politics beyond dualistic framings that oppose docility or consent on the one hand with anti-capitalist resistance on the other. At the same time, studies of alternative arrangements of human and non-human natures, which I also heard really great talks on today, including, for instance, urban school and community gardens, garden movements, all kinds of other cosmovisions, produce ecologies of care and community that moves beyond neoliberal modalities of engaging with self and others. Such diverse embodied experiences and experiments can lead to new praxis and mobilizations to rework urban natures with more or sometimes less emancipatory ends. Embodying urban ecologies in theory and practice thus deepens the field's understanding of the terrain of politics and potential transformation. Thank you.
Well, first I just want to say how honored I am and humbled to be up here with three amazing geographers and to be welcomed here at DOPE. So this is my first time here, so I really appreciate the invitation. Basically, everything Sapana said about what you just said just applied to urban agriculture. Actually,
good job.
There's a couple points in it actually that do overlap significantly. I'm not presenting a paper, I just have a series of comments that are really going to be digging into sort of what I see as these horizons. So I teach an undergraduate capstone every spring on urban agriculture and food systems at Portland State. And the first things I have my students do is to write an agri-food autobiography. I have them reflect on what brought them to the class. And then we revisit what brought them to the class, but also in their relationship to the agri-food system. And we revisit this assignment at the end of the term to think back on how their thinking has changed and on how their trajectory forward might also change. Reflecting on my own agri-food autobiography, or more specifically on my past decade of researching urban agriculture, has helped me recognize the evolution both in my thinking and in critical geography and political ecology's engagement with urban agriculture. So I want to speak to that this evening. and to point to some of the frontiers of political ecologies of urban agriculture that might help us better engage with some of the questions raised in the panel abstract and in the poem I took about. And I use the term frontier intentionally here for reasons that will become clear here in a moment. Going into a critical geography program at Berkeley 11 years ago now, as I was starting my PhD, I went in as a practitioner with a Master's of Science in Agroecology from a land grant and a few years of hands-on sustainable agricultural experience, and that was a challenge to say the least. For my first couple of years, I was deeply frustrated by critique as an end rather than as a means, and I wanted to do something. I couldn't understand why, after reading 250 pages of the latest political ecology monograph, only a paragraph at best was dedicated to possible solutions. And my take on urban agriculture at the time was very much informed by the dominant celebratory tone within the sustainable development world, but also from the critical social scientists celebrating urban agriculture's contributions to community building, its resistance to corporate agriculture, and its position as a site of contestation between use and exchange value within the context of Giuliani-era destruction of community gardens in New York. And much of this work pitted urban agriculture against capital. So in my own work, Marx and Harvey and Polanyi and this nascent, exciting new field at the time of urban political ecology figured heavily into my understandings of urban agriculture and food justice in the Oakland flatlands where I was doing my research. In retrospect, it was a blunt tool with which to understand class, race, and gender, but nevertheless articulated well with the participatory action research I was engaged in. The food justice activists I work with echoed this celebratory discourse that was common in the literature at the time, and they understood their work as building on earlier environmental justice activism, as well as the history of the Black Panthers' food work before that. So indeed, their missions and their own analysis seemed in stark contrast to the critiques that were emerging from critical food scholars I was reading at the time. So I'm thinking of work by Julie Guthman, Mary Beth Putta, Patricia Allen, etc., who painted alternative food networks, including urban agriculture, as classic rollout neoliberalism, shifting the responsibility to the individual and forming the formation of a neoliberal subject who'd be happy to play a part. And so while I was sympathetic to the scholarly critique, I did still see in urban agriculture and the food justice movement more broadly a radical organizing potential that was anti-capitalist. And as I argued in a piece called Radical Reformist or Garden Variety Neoliberal, the critical versus celebratory camps in the urban agriculture literature, I felt didn't allow us to come to terms with urban agriculture's contradictory motivations and functions, which often play out at different scales. And so more recent scholarship on urban agriculture has come to terms with this contradiction, I'm happy to note. And I'm thinking of the work perhaps, for example, Josh Speak of Evan Weissman, some of the new Right to the City and Production of Space scholarship on urban agriculture, so by Fred Eisenberg in New York, Katerina Pasadoma in New Orleans, who are contemplating urban agriculture through a Lefebvrean lens. When I moved to Portland 4 years ago, the new context forced me to begin thinking in new ways about urban agriculture and its role in urban transformation. In a city renowned for sustainability, it's been crucial for me to understand how ecotopian localist discourse is part and parcel of the gentrification and displacement that's made Portland one of the fastest gentrifying cities in the United States. A host of new scholars, and I say new scholars because many of them are graduate students, many of them are early career scholars, have contributed to new understandings of urban agriculture's entanglement and eco-gentrification. So Noah Postel, Sam Walker, Sarah Sopransky all come to mind. And their work has proven highly relevant to my own work in Portland, and now in Vancouver as well, where I've just begun a 3-year NSF-funded project working with Eugene McCann, Chris Meewald, and Simon Fraser. And always in search of contradiction, we're thinking about how municipal food policy not only facilitates eco-gentrification in both cities, but also serves as an important space for urban agriculture activists to bring equity or food justice concerns into the planning agenda. So I want to turn now to what I see as some frontiers in urban agriculture scholarship. So I'm going to mention 5, all of which overlap to some extent or the other. You heard from Rebecca Labe this morning, so first I want to mention the nascent subfield of critical physical geography that she discussed, that she's been spearheading. I think this offers an exciting opportunity for political ecologists to take seriously the materiality of soil, contaminants, plant communities, and to collaborate with environmental scientists, agroecologists, and physical geographers to understand urban agriculture's role in the socio-material transformation of cities, how this is connected to race, class, gender. And this approach has the potential to take urban political ecology's attention to metabolism to an entirely new level, particularly when it comes to urban agriculture. Here's where I overlap with Sapana's comment. A second area where I see a real growth potential is engaging urban agriculture through a lens of social reproduction. And so if you haven't seen this new volume yet, Precarious World, edited by Kendra Strauss and Katie Meehan, you have a chapter, right? No, you didn't, okay. Almost. Anyway, fabulous book on the UGA Press series. And it draws on the excellent work by feminist geographers who have engaged with the changing boundaries of social reproduction in the decades since Catherine Mitchell, Sally Marston, and Cindy Katz first published their seminal collection of life's work. So off the top of my head, I can't think of anybody working on urban agriculture in the global north anyway, explicitly engaging with the social reproduction literature, so please, if you know of somebody, tell me. I'm working on an article right now that's starting to think through how urban ag as social reproduction is valorized in a spatially differentiated manner. But I would really love to see some deep historical work that's using this lens, taking cues from Sylvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch, or some of the more recent feminist materialism to map the evolution of food production in cities. Third, race has figured and must continue to figure centrally in political ecologies of urban agriculture. We need to credit the seminal work of critical scholars of food and race such as Rachel Slocum, Julie Guthman, Patricia Allen, Ali Alcon, Breeze Harper, amongst others, for helping us understand urban agriculture's racialized contradictions and the whiteness of the food movement. But more recent work also does the important job of challenging the increasingly widespread narrative of urban agriculture as white hipster pastime. And this important work demonstrates that the transformation of urban nature, the cultivation of roses and of peppers and tomatoes and milk and eggs from concrete, is an older, ongoing story, one often with people of color protagonists leading the way, rather than the tattooed millennials gracing the front cover of New York Magazine. The new book by Kristen Reynolds and Nevin Cohen, Beyond the Kale, does great work to this end, as does Monica White's work on Detroit. Maggie Ramirez has a recent article in Anapode on Seattle that's particularly brilliant and draws on the plantation geographies of Catherine McKittrick and Clyde Woods, a lens which I think is incredibly powerful in its ability to link the site-specific and the embodied to the global longue durée processes of capitalism and racial formation. When it comes to race, however, for me, my comparative cross-border work in Canada has raised new questions for me in my own work, as well as revealed a blind spot in US-based urban agriculture scholarship. The fast and rich growing literature on the settler colonial city, but harkening back to Nick Blomley's seminal work on property and gentrification more than a decade ago, all the way to Glenn Coulthard's recent reflections on Ernst Melius, and to the many grad students organizing sessions at the AEG to explore and better understand settler colonialism as an ongoing process. We've heard quite a bit about that today. All add an important new dimension to Neil Smith's contributions on the discursive work of pioneers and frontiers in the gentrification process. And I mentioned Sarah Safransky, but her work on Detroit is particularly exciting for my own work and for anyone working on the greening of cities. So to make sense of urban agriculture's role in processes of urban transformation, those of us south of the border should take more seriously questions of land, law, dispossession, and indigeneity that this literature raises, while I think urban agriculture scholars to the north stand to benefit from engaging with some of the critiques levied by critical race scholars about how to engage blackness and settlers of color into the analysis. That brings me to the fourth frontier, which is the perennial struggle to bridge critique and praxis. And this is another theme that's come up through DOPE. How to bridge critique and praxis, scholarship, and activism. In a recent blog post, Mark Purcell wrote, "To be sure, there is a place for critique, for naming and opposing what is wrong with the world, but we rarely turn our attention to discovering those practices that enrich us as a community or as a species. Care, solidarity, democracy, mutual aid, commenting, etc. Learning them, narrating them, helping them grow." So I'm sympathetic with Mark's concerns as they take me back to my early frustrations with political ecology. But can we help cultivate the rose from the concrete and ask if we should be doing so? And of course we can, but I think it's not a straightforward task. In addition to engaging with activist struggles, as many of us political ecologists do, as we bring a particular political ecology into focus through our work. I think we need more scholarship on the engagement itself, on what scholar-activist, applied, or participatory urban political ecology looks like. Over the past decade, there's been a renaissance of scholar activism. It seems to me, and I'm pleased each year at the AAG and the various sub-conferences, and clearly here at DOPE, to see more and more sessions devoted to praxis and activism. Kate Derrickson and her colleagues tackled this in a particularly excellent series of articles on scholar activism, and they developed what they call politics of resourcefulness and how we as activists can contribute to movements. And there was a great scholar activist discussion on gentrification that I saw today at DOPE. And as always, I'm inspired by Nick's visions, in this case, his vision of an abolition ecology, and I'm sure we'll be talking a little bit about that. So this brings me to a closely related fifth area where I think political ecologies of urban agriculture might find fruitful ground in which to take root. Sorry for that illusion there. Which is critical self-reflexivity. Just critical reflexivity, rather. Something we take seriously already in political ecology, but I think this is an essential step towards the radical liberatory goals of an abolition ecology of urban agriculture. Which brings me full circle back to the agri-food autobiography. Where do we begin our autobiographies? Where do we begin our geographies? Which processes matter? What's the grain and extent? As geographers, we always struggle with this. One of Carolyn's former students, Zach Henson, wrote a powerful introductory chapter to his dissertation in which he situates his own work in relation to his personal journey to come to terms with the rewards of white supremacy he'd reaped as a white male growing up in the South. It was a candid reflection on his positionality and on his journey towards and through the anti-racist participatory action research on urban agriculture and food policy in Alabama he wrote about and that I believe he continues to engage with. And this is one kind of inner work that I think can and should precede our outer work. It's work that both humbles and empowers us in our commitments as scholar activists and as allies. I think the new subfield of geohumanities is one space that seems particularly well suited to this kind of work, a space that makes room for agri-food autobiographies, for the historical self-work necessary to push our own reflexivity, to be explicit about our positionality. It's a potential field where race, settler colonialism, social reproduction, critical reflexivity, narrative, performance, joy, hope, fear, and pain can all converge. So my own agri-food autobiography, my methodological self-work, my personal political ecology with its spatio-temporal scale jumping should extend back not only to the parched wheat fields of the family homestead in eastern New Mexico where my grandmother and her 12 siblings were born in a sod dugout, but also to the Homestead Act that granted them ownership of this land in 1907, in this quarter section of Choya cactus scrubland. It should go back to the Kiowa and Comanche who'd been pacified and dispossessed of this desert prairie a generation earlier, making way for my great-grandparents' arrival. And it should extend back to the arrival at Jamestown of my forebears 3 centuries earlier, the centuries-long migration that followed at a settler pace, Virginia, Georgia, East Texas, New Mexico. It should speak to the tattered will penned by one of my ancestors somewhere along the way, that enumerated the family's property, in which included one Negro named Sally and one Jenny Mule. So how does this history, how does such an agri-food autobiography relate to a political ecology of urban agriculture to the politics of urban transformation? Rather than evoking backyard chickens and raised beds, urban homesteading for me raises the question, whose city, whose land? It evokes the blood-soaked soil that served as fertile ground for my family tree as it was planted and replanted over centuries across the continent. Critical reflexivity, when it situates us as researchers within broader structures, is not only a question of positionality, but it's also coming to terms with history and our ongoing relationship to it, a step towards the truth and reconciliation that must serve as a precursor to an abolition ecology and a struggle against white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, and dispossession. It's a dialectical method that connects us as individuals to the multiple scales we political ecologists are so attuned to, pushing us to come to terms with our internal contradictions and to embrace the productive tension that gives us awareness and strength to squarely face the past, to unsettle the frontier however we can, and to ally with others in their efforts to do the same.
I'd also like to say thank you very much for inviting me to come here. It's an honor. It's a pleasure. I want to start with an episode that I think about in my mind as the post.
Yeah, you're saying.
Sorry. I apologize. I want to start with an episode that I think of as my post Nature Boys moment. And just for reference, Nature Boys was a tongue-in-cheek way in which Karen Backer once referred to a small group of us who had edited a book together in 2007. The group included James McCarthy, Scott Prudhomme, Paul Robbins, and I. It's a neoliberal environments book, and there's an author there, there's an author over there, there's some other folks that were involved in that. Honestly, if you know any of us, we say dude like every third word. So she was right to call us out. It's kind of embarrassing that we work together. The reason that I think a lot about that moment was it was just after that Noel Castry, with a meat cleaver in this hand and a scalpel in this one, started to shred most of the work that had been done on neoliberal natures up to that point. Having been blindsided and implicit in some ways, because if you're a footnote reader, on the first of three that he wrote, essays, the 2005 Environment and Planning A, I'm one of three people acknowledged. And that's because I was feeding him all of this literature as we were talking about the immersion of this thing. And then he turned around and said what he said. But, you know, as this game is played, it was good. It forced me to reconsider, to recalibrate, to really imagine and push myself. How do I think about case research? How do I think about empirical work? How do I think about heterodox subjectivities and forms of knowledge production across differentiated realms of urban and urbanizing political ecology? These are the sorts of things that I tried to take very seriously. How do we think about the translation rules, something that I talked about earlier? Essentially, Noel's critique, if you've not read these things, is you can't compare apples and oranges, you need to compare apples and apples. In fact, here's a bit from the very end of the 2005. He says, I think we need more rather than less attention to philosophical theoretical questions as a way of improving the quality and comparability of empirical case research. In many parts of human geography, I suspect that doing case research, getting one's hands dirty, is valued more highly than the hard work of figuring out how to best do case research. This latter work has a vital philosophical and theoretical dimension because it involves issues of ontology, epistemology, concept formation, classification, and so on. So someone who identifies with historical, geographical, materialist approaches to geography, someone that identifies and kind of thinks about Marxist geography, Noel's arguments made me feel like I needed to step up my dialectics, that I was failing, as I think many folks who do that kind of work also fail, when we don't do the relational philosophy of internal relations kind of work, as was just demonstrated in a very nice job in the previous session, thinking about various relations. The other thing that this did was it led me to start thinking more seriously about the historical connections between race, racialization, and property relations as one of these common threads that I think figures prominently and might offer up some translation rules for thinking about urban political ecology. So I'm gonna talk a little. I'm gonna jump all of a sudden out of left field in some ways. And I wanted to set up twin case studies that I've been spending a fair bit of time on recently. When I moved to Georgia, this was around the same time, 2007, I was recruited to be involved in something called the Long-Term Ecological Research Network. Does anyone know what LTER is? Okay, sorry. So from 2008 onward, maybe 2007, I've been involved in the Coweta LTER, and over the last 18 months or so, I've been slowly getting involved in the Georgia Coastal Ecosystems LTER. There are 25 active sites around the country, as shown here. Earliest 4 were in 1980. It's the largest, longest-lived ecological network in the United States. They sell it as being interdisciplinary, but that's really within physical sciences. It's like 99.6% physical scientists, and then there's some token social scientists, and I'm one of them. So this is big ecology. This is big science. Six-year grants, $8 million plus, okay? So it's pretty serious stuff. UGA hosts 2 of these sites. It's the only university to have multiple sites, and it has a lot to do with Eugene Odom's who was there and his involvement in helping to facilitate this. A point that I want to come back to at the very end is that given that I'm one of the token social scientists in this whole network, it is ironic to me that as of next week, I will be an incoming deputy director of the Coweta site. In many ways, this makes absolutely no sense, right? But I'm going to try and rationalize, I think, at the end, why I think this is happening. So just because we like maths, there we are. We're talking about Coweta and GCE. And let me just say, I mean, if we go back to some of Noel's critiques, there's an incredible, what do I want to say? I want to say a knowledge economies of scale playing out here, right? So at the Coweta site, since 1980, there's been over 1,300 publications, peer-reviewed publications around all kinds of things ecological, 250 dissertations and theses out of this project. I don't know the stats for the GCE. But if we overlay that with something like this, right? So this is a projected sprawl that's going to happen over the southeast up into 2060. It's from a paper, Taranto et al. The title is The Southern Megalopolis, Using the Past to Predict the Future of Urban Sprawl in the Southeast, right? There's a lot going on in this region right now, and to the degree that trying to make any sense of it is difficult. It's very challenging to try and make sense of it. At least for me. I mean, you have essentially Atlanta and Charlotte forming the kind of edges of this thing that's is kind of out of control. It's outpacing scientists or political ecologists' ability to make sense of it in some ways. Folks like Laura Taylor, who's somewhere out here, there you are, has done some very important work in terms of thinking about exurbanization, and other folks in the room have also. That is some of the most important thinking on it right now. If we kind of, so that's the Coweta range that we're talking about there. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll just leave it at that. That's the Coweta scale. If we jump over there, the Georgia coast is experiencing insane growth right now. We're talking about the 6 coastal counties will double in population between now and 2040. And Dean Hardy, who's sitting right there, has done really incredible dissertation work on kind of thinking about some of these development trends and thinking about them within the context of sea level rise. So I thank him because he's helped me think a lot through some of these questions that I'm interested in. And I think that all of them kind of speak to David and Hillary, Wachsmuth and Angelo's discussions about methodological cityism. That there isn't actually a lot going on outside of what some folks refer to as urban political ecology. So anyway, I set all this up just as a way of trying to jump to how to bring in this discussion of the history of race and private property relations more thoroughly. So I've had a long interest in kind of anti-racist, black power, abolitionist theory. I haven't always mobilized it in my writing, but it's kind of been up here. When I moved to Georgia from Milwaukee, and if anyone knows Milwaukee, it's kind of an interesting place in terms of race relations. I was kind of blown away just to kind of be in a place and start to read the history as I kind of dive into places and read the stuff about the places. It was striking to me. It really kind of transformed me in many ways. And Du Bois was someone who I drew on heavily and draw on heavily now. So at the page 714 of this book, which is telling, right? There's at least 714 pages of this book. Du Bois says this: if history is going to be scientific, if the record of human action is going to be set down with that accuracy and faithfulness of detail which will allow its use as a measuring rod and a guidepost for future nations, there must be some set standards of ethics in research and interpretation. He goes on, the title is called The Propaganda of History, right? It's fascinating the way he tells us how we need to be better historians in thinking about Black Reconstruction at the end of the book. So the argument that I want to make, that I'm trying to think through, and I'm obviously happy to take any thoughts on this, is how to deepen the way in which we think about the long term, or what Laura Pulido has been talking about in the context of deep history, through an approach that takes property seriously and allows us to better integrate colonial dispossession in rigorous and robust ways. And I'll show a few maps here in a second that I think are important. how we can situate white supremacy within these contexts of ecology, right? Oftentimes these are separate conversations, and the question is how do we figure out ways, sentences, narratives that allow us to bring these together around the same kind of audiences of folks that care about both, right? I mean, this is one of them. So, but how do we do more of that? And so, drawing on Du Bois's notion of abolition democracy, I've been playing around a little bit, I'd say, with this idea of abolition ecology. So, this is a crazy figure. It's wild, and I'm not going to go through it, so don't worry. Essentially, it conveys, but going back to 1980, all the research that's been done at Coweta, right, including the next 4 years of the proposal that is due next week. So there's a lot going on here, and I helped create this figure with a wicked smart ecologist, and we sat in his room with a whiteboard, and he did most of the work, but I kind of piped it in here and here and here. And the thing that one of the things I'm most proud of over the last probably 2 years are 15 letters on here. That, right? Because in situating a deeper historical understanding of this region in this figure that is the roadmap to the research that we're going to do, now I can talk about Cherokee removal within this ecosystem in a way, and I think the thing that makes me so excited is the fact that I was able to get 25 other people to agree ultimately that it was so important that it had to be there. And so that's one of these kind of, it's a micro move, right? I probably shouldn't be as excited as I am about it. Most people probably don't actually even notice it. Had I not put that circle there, I don't know if any of you would have, right? But it's there, and I think that that's very important. That's a multi-million-dollar figure behind us, which makes me a little nervous to even talk about it in those terms, because it's just stressful. So, you know, this is the kind of backdrop that we can think about some of these other maps. This is from Inskeep's book from NPR fame that maybe some of you know, called Jackson Land, in which he talks about the colonial dispossession of the Cherokee within this region. And there's lots of statistics that I could talk about. The one thing that I'll just simply say is that the eastern band of the Cherokee resisted the Trail of Tears, hung out in the mountains. They kind of resisted Jackson's military, and out of 800 members of the tribe have repopulated. They've fought back and acquired a land holding of it's 57,000 acres, the Koala boundary. It's their reservation, although it's not a reservation per se. And through gaming revenues right now and a whole host of other kind of tourist dynamics, they're really becoming a power broker in this region and thinking about urbanization, right? So clearly there's a lot of really wicked smart folks who have thought about indigenous knowledge around ecological issues that you know, can come to bear on some of these questions as we move forward. And again, the Coweta study area. So I want to just jump to juxtapose. As I mentioned, I'm more slowly getting involved into the Georgia Coastal Ecosystems Project, which is there. But here's another figure, right? And I think this figure is interesting in some ways and less interesting in others, right? It doesn't have the same historical ability to kind of articulate what's been going on the Georgia coast. It's got this area here, which allows for those sorts of discussions, right? But in much more generic, kind of decontextualized ways. So there's wiggle room, but it's not historically specific. Again, I'm the only, well, Dean and I are the only two social scientists that have really, well, there's an archaeologist, Victor. Archaeology, social science. I'm learning. So there's no real, and they all are interested, right? But they don't have the training or what have you to think about these same questions. So it's really important if we think about something like this, and we actually think about the history of what's going on there and how they're parallel in some more contemporary ways to what's been going on within the Southern Alps. So Sapelo Island, and I think that there's a PhD student here in Kentucky that's doing work on Sapelo. Is that right? Yeah. Well, yeah. That was the anthropologist in the back. Yeah, right. She didn't leave. Very more contemporarily, kind of very important issues going on. So Sapelo is the home of folks who are saltwater Geechee, native residents of a community called Hog Hammock. It's a very small, privately held community. And through property tax increases, through the same kind of exurbanization, urbanizing, second homeowner kind of pressures, we see displacement. We see kind of the pushing out of this very important Georgia community. And so again, it's not in that other figure, but it's there, right? So how do we think about that in various ways? Back to Du Bois, I guess I'll cut. I mean, the notion of abolition democracy for Du Bois was that slaves fighting for their freedom, even if they, after the Emancipation Proclamation, would still not be free because they were existing within a society that was dominated by white supremacy, right? So there's this kind of issue there. He goes in to talk about the counter-revolution of property. And seeing the time, I won't go into this, but one of the issues around property is that the abolition democracy was based on the importance of property, right? We can think about 40 acres and a mule. We can think about some of the discussions there that over time have worked in counterproductive ways, counter-revolutionary ways, Du Bois would say, and that opens up for a whole host of discussions around property relations that I think are very important and are just kind of at the very beginning of some discussion. There's not a lot. There's some really powerful discussions of property within political ecology. We go back to the Blakey Brookfield days and all the way through. It's not very common though, right? It's not a big theme. So my title actually comes from a really fantastic special issue of the Professional Geographer that Rich wrote the introduction for and was involved in, that Bobby Wilson wrote a paper in there. And in this paper, Bobby is talking about Du Bois and Richard Wright. If you haven't seen, this is the same very famous special issue that Ruthie Gilmore's discussion around the fatal couplings is in. What Bobby says is we must situate race not only in a historical context, but also in a historical geographical context. We must expose the skeletons of places and plant the flesh of black experiences on those bones as well. Social practices are not only historically specific, but geographically or place specific, even in the age of globalization. The point of this quote is that we have a lot of tools to do this kind of work, right, as geographers. There's a lot of rich geographic theory to think through some of these bridges, and I've been harnessing it, right, and I've been convincing folks that it's important and that we have to take it more seriously. So, I made the kind of joking point about becoming the deputy director. I know how to use Excel. I'm pretty organized, right? So I can do some administrative things. But I actually think that the reason that this has occurred is that all these ecologists really care about the relevancy of their science. And they really actually want to have someone around who's going to push them to think through these bigger questions, right? I have seen since 2007, at the very beginning of my time in this project, people telling me that my ideas were crazy, that this was science, that this is ecology, there's no room for that kind of talk. Now, there's a majority of the folks that are embracing the kinds of conversations that we're having. And so, thinking about various participatory, thinking about some of the things that maybe Tracy's going to talk about tomorrow, there's a lot of room for making these kinds of bridges. And again, I think historical property relations is one important way to do that. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
So I was trying to think about what I was going to do because I actually want to open it up, but I was listening to it in different ways because I read some of what they said before and then I wrote some stuff and then I changed my mind, which I'm prone to do. So what I'm going to do instead is I want to call out some words from each person that I heard because I just want to throw them out there because there's something about viscerally understanding what we heard from Sapana. Collapse, inner city, exposed, present, inclusive, deliverance, constructed, lambasted, waged on a daily basis, present, exposed, despite lived nature, embodied struggles, embodied risk, metabolism, embodied ecologies, reoriented, differentiated, and embodied, trivialized, stigmatized, misinterpreted by upper classes, misinterpreted by improvement projects, misinterpreted by bourgeois environmentalists, from New Orleans to Mumbai, constantly threatened. Nathan, horizons, the frontier, and I was thinking historically can be violent for some. Care, solidarity, scholar activism, critical reflexivity, liberatory goals. Where do we begin our geographies? Rewards of white supremacy, ecology, care, and community, inner work individually. And I would add within political ecology and geography, tattered wills, not just paper, but something else, coming to terms with ourselves at multiple scales. Nick, post-nature boy moment, dude. Neoliberal natures, shredded, dude. How do I think about differentiated realms? Getting hands dirty, dude. Historical connections, race and property, ecological networks, dude. Big science, token social scientists, knowledge economies of scales, important thinking, methodological cityism, Du Bois, dude. The propaganda of history. How do we think about the long term? Deep history, white supremacy, race and property, not separate but equal, abolition ecology, micro moves, Cherokee removal, stressful as we move forward, a pushing out. How do we think about this? Abolition ecology, dude. I do have questions, but I kind of want to throw that. I wanted to throw that out there because I started to think about things like, because we asked the question. Well, I'm going to say one thing. I told you I lie. I just want to say one thing, and then I actually want to open it up because, and this is just me playing this role, because you know I love you. So, Nathan, what I heard you say, and what I read was that you asked, can we cultivate the rose from concrete? And then I love Bobby Wilson, and I love that quote, but I sort of pull out a line there. We must expose the skeletons of places and plant the flesh of Black experiences on those bones as well. And I'm glad you asked the question, and should we be cultivating? Because actually, when I look at the Tupac Shakur poem, for me, what he's saying, they are the rose. The woman that you were describing is the rose. And the question for all of those engaged in any kind of intellectual production and reproduction of knowledge is, should we be cultivating it in the first place? And who asked us to? And what does that look like? And for me, that's part of that critical reflexivity that all of you I think, are talking about to some degree. That's all I'm gonna say. You might respond to that, you might not. But if anybody has a question.
Thirsty.
Was there? Oh, yeah, sorry.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Aaron Albrecht, and I'm
Should you do
Thank you. Nobody forget your question. My name is Aaron Albrecht, and I'm a master's student at the College of William and Mary. I'm studying policy analysis. And although in our program we study poverty, I believe that the program itself suffers from a different sort of poverty, and it might be considered a methodological poverty. Would you please point me and maybe some other aspiring researchers in this room in the direction where we might find materials on public methodology? How can we, learn about this and synthesize it into our own works? Thank you.
There's going to be a talk tomorrow that's...
I'll say more about this tomorrow. But really quickly, we have what's called the Public Political Ecology Lab out of the University of Arizona in the Geography Department. And on that webpage, we have a lot of information, resources, links on participatory action research methods, participatory GIS, sort of ethics of field work, pedagogy. So definitely check that out if you haven't already, but I'll certainly say more about it tomorrow.
Thank you very much. What's that called?
What exactly were you saying?
Ecology Lab, PPEL, at Arizona.edu.
Hi. So I just wanted to ask, from a perspective of being a former historical archaeologist, delving into garbology right now, but how can historical archaeologists and archaeologists take more seriously political ecology and an ecology in their works in a way where they can position the materiality that they're looking at as enhancing the history and geography that you're looking at? You had mentioned that some of the archaeologists you're working with, you're starting to find value in what they're doing, but what aren't we doing to communicate well enough yet?
That's my ignorance, not my colleagues.
Okay. Well, but then the first question, how can historical archaeologists take more seriously ecology in their work as well? I don't know if anyone...
Just very quickly. I mean, the archaeologist that we work with, I mean, what he's been doing is kind of recounting some of the indigenous settlement on the island. So, I mean, he's doing the deep history work and exposing the kind of the longer term, which I guess is what archaeologists do, as I'm becoming to understand, at least partially. So I think I think it's what I would say. My own experiences is more on me to kind of take a few steps toward him. Not to let you off the hook, but you know.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
So I'm an anthropologist, and Victor was one of our PhD students here at UK, which is my ecology class a long time ago. So one of the things I think is that in graduate programs there can be divisions among subfields, and so it's partly pushing back against that to make sure that these conversations are happening during training. So it's coming to events like this, and interdisciplinary conversations is a big part of it, and then a little extra work because of the way programs are designed, where you're expected to finish quickly, and that doesn't allow for the interdisciplinary conversations that might be the most productive. Thanks for wanting to.
I might add a little bit just in relation to critical physical geography, because I think there's actually a similarity in terms of, as an archaeologist, I think you're trained in a lot of, especially, highly technical techniques of, I don't know what you use these days, is, X-ray the ground or whatever, before you then scrape off, 1 centimeter at a time, et cetera. So there's a lot of method that you all are, masters at, in the same way that a lot of environmental scientists, they have their, isotopic analysis of a particular molecule, right? That a political ecologist isn't going to either have the training or the time to do, and I think it's having those kinds of collaborations, essentially. Nick had the label Cherokee removal up there, right? And so the ecologist might be looking at some differentiation of the actual, whatever the particular, soil types or plant communities or whatever on either side of that label, but he's going to be working with, he or she's going to be working with Nick to then think about, well, how is that connected to the processes of Cherokee removal, the politics that went into it, the ideology driving it, right? It's not everybody can be trained in understanding both of those things, but they need to have that conversation and actually go at the question together, side by side. So I think that's whether you're an environmental scientist or the political ecologist or the archaeologist, I think it's just having those conversations together.
Thank you. Thank you for the panel. It was really wonderful. Sapana, I really love the idea of thinking about metabolism literally. And I kind of was thinking of trying to put that in conversation with what Nick was doing. I'm thinking about if it makes sense to think of white supremacy having a metabolism. And I mean that very literally, right? So Bobby Wilson makes me think of the way that the extraction of coal and the extraction of this iron ore is productive of white supremacy, right? And I just wondered if the two of you could have a conversation about that, really. Or just had any thoughts about that?
Yeah. She's like, yeah, we can.
Yeah, we will. We will.
Yeah, and I think that, for me, I think that sort of thinking about the consumption of these resources and how they produce certain bodies with certain privileges, right? And sort of going between these kind of group experiences, right? So when you're talking about white supremacy, and it's about a particular group through historical processes that has been able to, gain this privilege. And then going back and forth, I think, with, what that experience is at the embodied level too. I mean, I think of, these things that go around Facebook, right? And you had that period that, I don't know if you saw it, all these white people basically talking about their interactions with the police, one kid being drunk and punching an officer and, getting away with, basically the officer took him home. And just the kind of privilege, really, right, that a young African-American boy carrying a toy gun could never afford. And then I think it's really important, so the point that I'm trying to make, I think, is that it's really important to then to bring these group understandings of metabolism together inside the body, and because it can produce different kinds of responses, right? And it can produce, I think, thinking through, the group and the individual and how those interact, can help us to understand how subjectivities start forming, and it doesn't always have to, I think in certain ways, right, white privilege can be critiqued internally when one is reflective of that experience too. So I think that's what I'm trying to get at. Talk with me about it.
I mean, I think we go back to Justus von Liebig's kind of, discussion of metabolism, who was this German soil scientist that Marx took it up from and ran, and then it became more metaphorical. I mean, I think there's a lot of room still. I mean, it is one of these words that's been getting used more and more and more, and so it might, given we're a trendy group, might have a shelf life that it's about to expire. But I think that there's still some good work to be done there, and I think that if I just think about my own, some little work that I've done on hunger and anti-hunger politics, trying to think about metabolism in that way and access to food, both in the body but then through the market, it would only be a slight jump for me to start to think about the white supremacist kind of dynamics therein.
Nick, I have a question for you. I'm really interested in this concept of abolition ecologies, and I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on it, and also, is it different than when people talk about decolonization or emancipation or liberation? Like, how do you envision this?
That's why I said I've been toying around with it, because I mean, so Rich, wherever he went, asked me when I was here some time ago, and he said, well, what's being abolished? I mean, abolition of slavery was a very kind of clear goal, right? I think what Du Bois does in kind of framing this notion of abolition of democracy is that he tries to take some of the spirit of the politics, and he thinks about the goal, but then he kind of busts it wide open. I think that the chapter that I alluded to, the counter-revolution of property, there are all these contradictions that he brilliantly kind of brings out of this particular moment. I mean, there are very few books that are published in 1935 that have the staying power of this particular volume. So I think that it speaks to his knowledge. I guess what I would say is, I think it does have to do with some of the same kind of questions around democracy and the way in which we think about environmental politics. But I also want to try to continue to develop in my mind some of these questions around property that clearly, I mean, Du Bois, for the whole 783 pages of this book, I mean, these are paramount questions for him. And I think that it's pretty important for what many of us are interested in, are those property relations. I just don't think we've talked enough about it yet. So that's a chunky kind of an answer. But yeah, thank you for asking.
Yeah, sorry, I have a question for Nick over here. Yeah, and this is related. How do you get your work with Elter? How do you get natural scientists to think beyond positivism? And I'll give you an example of where I'm coming from. I teach in Southern California. I'm a cultural anthropologist, but I work with a
a plant sciences PhD student who was working on community gardens in Los Angeles. And so she was working in Santa Monica and South Central and Koreatown, like 12 different community gardens around the city. And she has interesting findings around the diversity of plants and different kinds of plants that are grown, and also around things like lead levels in kale. Right? And to me, this immediately calls for a theorization in terms of the broader processes of production of urban spaces and the historical political ecology. And I found it impossible to get her to sort of think beyond the variables that she had collected. So how do you do that?
Let me tell you. I think Rebecca's talk earlier today, started to really get into that in a deeper way than I'm going to be able to. I can talk about it in a kind of autoethnographic sense. What I'll tell you is that last week I spent hours and hours and hours working on directional hypotheses. Which I don't know, I had a hard time. It was why I spent so long. I couldn't just do it. Like my colleagues were spitting out these rad directional hypotheses. I don't think that way. And so I think that there was a lot of back and forth. And I think that the beauty of this project is it is long-term. So that's not only from the perspective of the observation, but of the trust building and the relationship building and the kind of the communications that we've developed over the time that we've been doing this work. And so I think, it's a matter of saying, you don't have to figure this out. You just have to trust me enough to know that I'm not bullshitting you, And likewise, when I didn't do a whole host of other things last week because of these damn directional hypotheses that I had to frame. And I felt like I was wasting my time, but I realized, no, I'm going to trust you, and I'm going to think through this. So I think it comes down to trust. Some of those kind of relationship kind of issues. Team science. We spent a lot of time at UGA through this program that there are a whole bunch of folks here from talking about team science and that they are interpersonal kind of things that lead to the co-production of particular kinds of knowledge.
We probably have time for one more, but maybe not, maybe two.
I'm the first one of the two more. Yeah. Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm coming from Clark. And my question builds on a lot of work that Janae and Alex behind me have been doing at Clark, organizing anti-racist work across the university. And so my question is for Nathan and all of the panelists, but especially for you, because you talked about the history, having your students write these histories, and then you gave your own history, which was very powerful, and something that we witnessed some people do at a race forum, which took place just 2 days ago, and then at the end, when the president of the university and the associate provost made their final comments, they were unable to make any connection, personal connection. They made just really broad comments of like, thank you for attending the race forum, we'll send an email at some point, wait for our email. And so when you have your students do these histories, how do you encourage them, because you have a limited amount of time with them, to really delve into that? Like, what are the practices around that? And then for all of you, how have you done the inner work, and how do you encourage your colleagues and your students, undergrads and grads, to do that, and maybe some practical tips that we can all take home with us?
Thanks for your question. It's great. And I'd love to hear more about the project you guys are working on, Clark, that they're working on too. It's a quarter system, so we're 10 weeks, right? And it's focused on the food system, and so we've got a lot of sort of ground to cover. But there's a couple weeks of a week sort of on race and agriculture and privilege and so just like a lot of sort of introductory readings that I think a lot of them have been exposed to for the first time, the backpack of white privilege, things like that. And so some of them have had exposure to it, but most of them haven't. And so I think just having that week, then followed by a week on gentrification, which is a huge problem in Portland, as I mentioned. And then we're also working in collaboration with a community organization. And then there have been a couple of the projects we worked on were working through a process of having the organization itself kind of work reflexively about like its whiteness within a historically African American community in Portland, and then having them sort of develop a blueprint framework for what we call it a food justice framework, that included anti-oppression, anti-racism training for the people who were participants in that organization. So I think having the students in some ways taking the lead on developing that blueprint really was transformative for a lot of them. At the end of the project, their sort of final reflection on their own agri-food biography, a lot of it harkened back to that and just those sets of readings and getting them to realize these things that they hadn't necessarily been exposed to before. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of the process that I've used.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a complex question, right? When you're reflecting, and then, I mean, I think about my own privilege or not, lack thereof, in different spaces, right? Going, doing my work in India and the kinds of, locations that I have there versus here. And I mean, I don't know if I'm done working through all of it, but I think in terms of where I think we need to go, that's really productive, and I can see in a lot of instances where we have a lot of work to do in order to make that happen is a little bit of what Rebecca was saying this morning, to really create spaces where authority and authoritative knowledge, right, is not just reproduced over and over again. And I mean, I feel like in a lot of radical spaces, right, you see this perhaps even more, sadly, radical academic spaces, this kind of, and so the more and more that we can do that, and I feel like in India I've been to some conferences where they're really experimenting a lot more with that of really how, it's not that you're going to be able to undo, centuries of dispossession and marginalization, oppression, all these things, but just more and more creating the space to undo the internalized aspects of who is authoritative and who isn't, and in that practice, in the moment, in those spaces, to just sort of break them down and not have time and space and the ability to vocalize being given only to certain groups within that space. So, yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah.
I have to add to that, even though I'm not supposed to say anything. I really want to, because I also do the environmental autobiography with students as well. And there's something about them having ownership of the material by being able to give voice to their own story, and often saying that they don't have a story about the environment or resources or farming. And actually, I always remind them that you're breathing, you have a story.
Yeah.
But the other thing I tell them, there's actually no right answer. So however you choose to tell that story, is I have to learn how to hear you, because that's part of the exercise. It's not one directional. And it really came home for me about the last 3 years I've been able to teach for 3 weeks in Japan to Japanese students who can speak English about the history of culture and natural resources in the United States. And I'm asking them to write an environmental autobiography, and English is their second language. So often when they would hand it back to me, there would be, how can I say this? The sentences, the grammar would be incorrect by English standards. And what I started doing was changing it and I realized it changed the meaning of what it was that they were trying to tell me, so I stopped doing that. I would give them two versions. I would say, well, here's the grammatical correction, but here's what I'm hearing you say. So there's something about creating that space for however somebody wants to tell you that story, because that's also, for me, the thing that's hard for us to put our finger on, but actually I think that's what expands the way we understand and know and come to appreciate the different ways people think about and engage these issues. Who now said my saying? Now we're done.